America, my name is Osei-Frimpong. I come to you live every Thursday about this time. And, we study the civil rights movement, or you're taught the civil rights movement in school young, and you're taught the civil rights movement before you're taught about Jim Crow. And what happens is then you end up reading into the pre-civil rights era, the civil rights victory. So you start to think that if you think of Jim Crow at all, you start to think that racial discrimination is about, lunch counters and water fountains and schools in a way that's, you read the victories of the civil rights movement back in as problems of the Jim Crow South. And you have to understand that for, Black people lived in the South, and Black people still disproportionately live in the South. But before the Great Migration, like, when you're talking about Black people, you're talking about the urban areas, and you're talking about the American South, and that's about it. Because the Homestead Act didn't agree. Like back when they were giving out parcels of lands to the whites in the end of the 19th century, the middle of the end of the 19th century, that didn't actually, that was racially prohibitive. So Black people lived in the South. And if you don't know, Ira Katznelson's Affirmative Action, When Affirmative Action Was White's actually a pretty good book about this kind of stuff. 75% of the Black workforce was either domestic workers or farm workers. So prior to the Great Migration, 40s through 60s, like we were in the South and we worked on either, in white houses or on farmland, like either directly or indirectly for whites. I mean, there were some people who owned and there were some business districts, but for the most part, 75% of the workers worked for a white boss, and we didn't know anything, so we couldn't own anything functionally. So the problem is, if you don't study Jim Crow, you think the civil rights movement is about voting, lunch counters, and water fountains. But what it actually, if you look at and you read successes with regard to that as the problems that were to be previously addressed in Jim Crow. But the problems of Jim Crow were assault, state-sponsored violence, wage theft, property theft, the sexual availability of Black women. When they went into these white women, they could just be raped. And if any guy, the annals are filled with guys who tried to defend Black women and ended up lynched, right? By the way, if you want a good book on that, go to Trouble in Mind by Leon Litwack. I read books, but it's the best book on Jim Crow that I think I've read, because it details from both the white and Black perspective the fascination with keeping Black people in their place and all of the manifest ways with which it was done, and the targeting of the Black family, the Black church, the truth that we couldn't really have assets. We really couldn't have assets up and through the 20th century. We could have the assets that white people didn't want, but as soon as white people wanted your land, they either through legal or through terrorism, they took it. There were pogroms and massacres up and down the South because for some reason, like, white people were done with Black people on a certain plot of land, so they just ran them off. Right. So the inability to build anything, and everybody knows about the Tulsa riot or the Rosewood riots or the Wilmington riots or the Memphis riots or the New Orleans riots, and just the threat of riots means that Black people couldn't actually hold anything, because these were all riots, but they were all just varieties of race massacres, right? And that's what Jim Crow was about. The inability of Black people to actually press their rights with respect to property, with respect to wages, with respect to economic opportunities, with respect to, their physical safety from the cops who use vagrancy laws in order to, suck in Black people, or poverty laws in order to suck in Black people and then lease them out as functionally slaves. Hillary Clinton had one of these slaves. When Clinton was the governor of Arkansas, sometimes I call them trustees, but pretty much you have prison workers who come and do things that like slaves used to do, right? So The deep problem is that it wasn't about water fountains. It wasn't even about voting necessarily. It was all of these things were the means to get at the bigger problem, which was the targeting of any black social institution that could lead to autonomous power. And autonomous power is going to be power that could negate the wills of the whites. You're not autonomous if you can't negate the will of other people who have aspirations on you. Because if you have a plan and they have a plan and their plan involves you and you can't negate their plan, your plan is irrelevant. Part of what it is to be autonomous is to be able to negate the plan. So unless you have an understanding of Jim Crow, of the property, the wage theft, the vulnerability to legitimate and illegitimate authority, and the inability to sustain families, because in Put Trouble in Mind they talk about how the black family got in debt. What happened was they'd have to pull out the kids and put the kids to work. So there is the overdetermination of black even family life because of economic degradation. And so unless you understand all of that, you don't really know the civil rights movement. And not only do you not know the civil rights movement, you don't know the failures, the ultimate failures. Because even King died thinking, the movement's ultimately a failure. And unless white people were declaring victory because they didn't have to give up anything. Right? So unless you actually know Jim Crow, you don't understand the civil rights movement. And if you study the civil rights movement without studying Jim Crow, what happens is you read the victories of the civil rights movement as the problems of Jim Crow. And you still don't know why black families have such a hard time right now, why the divorce rate's so high, why the home ownership rate is so low. Right? And if you don't have answers to those kinds of questions, you can't answer the one question that your kid either asks or doesn't know how to ask, but notices is that why are black people broke? And why do I get to treat them like garbage? And why is it just assumed that I'm better than them? Like if you're white and you don't have a good answer to that question, you're just raising a racist. Why are black people broke? And if you don't have a good answer as to the question of why are black people broke, and that answer doesn't point to the targeting of the community in all of these manifest ways, from religion to family to jobs to property assets to physical assault to sexual assault and to terrorism and all of those different spheres, then you're raising functionally a racist. And with that, go ahead and let me hit the beat.
To the beat, y'all. Yeah. Sound good to me. Never change the ways for the world or the government. If I was the president, then I would state facts. You leave it up to me, I paint the White House black and it can feature in your front. To the beat, y'all. Yeah. Sound good to me. Never change the ways for the world or the government. If I was the president, then I would state facts. You leave it up to me, I paint the White House black and it can feature in your front.
So once again, if you try to study the civil rights movement without studying Jim Crow first, what happens is that you read the victories of the civil rights movement as the problems of Jim Crow, when the problems of Jim Crow are actually much more general and much more pervasive. And they're still with us, which accounts for black cultural degradation and material degradation. And, you have to point to both the whites' material and psychological benefit they get from maintaining a racial hierarchy, but also they just set the system so that even if you aren't particularly invested in the racial hierarchy, fighting it will cost you, your property values, it'll cost you your jobs, it'll make things harder for you, right? So it becomes harder to actually, the rules become the case where treating black people like trash becomes incentivized. So even if you're race neutral, but you're not money neutral or you're not esteem neutral, money and esteem comes from degrading or gaslighting or somehow giving short shrift to the justice claims of Black Americans, of the tens of millions of Black Americans in the United States, a third of Georgia, right? And if you don't have an answer to the question of why are Black people broke, why aren't the families staying together, why is the home ownership rate so low? If you don't have a good answer to that question that reaches all the way back to the terrorism, the multifaceted, entrenched terrorism of Jim Crow, and how that was only partially remediated through the civil rights era, then what you're doing is just raising low-key racists and just perpetuating the same degradation that will make it the case that, the trajectory of Black life is not particularly great right now. We're trying to change that directory. By the way, if you appreciate the way I'm changing that directory, go ahead and go to www.funkyacademic.com and kick in $5, $15, and $50 a month to keep me kind of doing what I'm doing, because you're not going to get the quality of education and insight that you get here in other places, right? Because it doesn't pay. Nobody gets paid for telling you to study Jim Crow. And don't study the civil rights movement, or study the civil rights movement as a partial remediation of Jim Crow. But you need to study Jim Crow. And the book, Trouble in Mind by Leon Litwack, I think it's the best one I've read. It's stunning and readable. And it's readable. Some deeper text go into this, but you need a pretty deep theory brain. Trouble in Mind is actually just a readable history of Jim Crow. Right, and you just see that these problems are still with us. And like I said, it's both the material and psychic benefit that is delivered by, being able to order Black people around and have them not be able to effectively fight back. But it's also, when you set the rules that way, then everybody comes to benefit. Even if you just got here, even if you're Caribbean, even if you're Black yourself, and you just get here, you see the rules, give you a bonus for treating Black people as a subordinate class, Black Americans, Black descendants of slaves, as a subordinate class, and you see that you get punished for actually, articulating the justice claims of Black Americans. So both the direct psychological benefit and the indirect social benefit of treating Black people like garbage needs to be clarified if we actually get serious about addressing the question, why are Black people broke? And why don't their institutions work? In the way that, why do they have lead in their water? You have to, in a way that actually answers that question. And you can't dodge that question. And you can't dodge that question saying, well, Black people aren't broke. Some people have it. No. Like I said, Georgia's a third Black. You want to know how much commercial real estate we own? We probably own as much as Ted Turner. It's like one dude in Georgia, right? So if you don't, and this is a market-based society, so if you don't own commercial real estate, how much in the game are you? We can't even rent the commercial real estate because, all right, so here's something you might know. You see a lot of boarded up shops in some urban areas. Even Athens, Georgia has some boarded up shops. What happens is that one old white family owns entire blocks, an entire swaths of commercial property, but they want to keep the rent high and the headaches low. So they'll get one tenant who pays full and can cover the property taxes because they own it, it's been in the family for generations, and since the Klan won it, right? At an auction for terrorizing a Black family up. So they want to keep the potential lease value high, so they only need one tenant who will cover enough profit for the taxes on the rest, and then they can keep the rest boarded up until they find another golden tenant. Right. In a well-ordered world, we would just, talk about some of that inherited commercial wealth and distribute it appropriately at like a Black auction, but there are other there are other schemes, and just distribute it to members of the community. Or at least, you could do this a few ways. You could just raise property taxes so much that they have to force to sell it. But that would still not actually solve the problem unless black people had the money. It would just be other whites who have the money who would buy the commercial property. So what you need to do is confiscate it and confiscate inherited commercial property, and then start a process of distributing it to people whose lineage can show some sort of degradation. And, Sandy Darity talks about reparations plans along those lines and how a committee would be formed and all of that. But this is the terms you have to speak it. And if you don't have an answer to that question, if your answer to that question doesn't go into Jim Crow, and the asymmetries that was set up in Jim Crow coming out of Reconstruction, the asymmetries in power. So what happened was, at the end of Reconstruction, when the North pulled out effectively and saying, just kind of abandoned Southern blacks, most of the blacks, to the Klan, then the white administrators made it the case that you couldn't actually have a life without being dependent on whites. Right, so black land claims didn't mean much. What ended up happening is you needed a white master. Like black people had like a white patron, pretty much. You call him. He was either a boss or the person who owned the farm. Like in some way or another, black people, they might get to pick their patron in a way that they couldn't before, but black people weren't able to sustain autonomous property claims against the terrorism of the whites. Because when black people sustained autonomous property claims, the whites would just riot and run them out. Or Trouble in Mind has story after story about like black guys getting lynched just because they were too successful and getting ideas. Right, they were simply too successful. They had too much money, so they had to get lynched to send a message to everybody else that the only way to get along was to work for the whites. Right, so and this is up into the 20th century. So you have to understand that this isn't ancient history, and property claims are old. Like the University of Georgia, where I'm at, is 200 years old. Right, so property claims are old. And the white families who own so much are old. And the white because their great-granddaddy terrorized, and then the property just moved in white circles. Like through white churches and through marriages and through generations in the same lineage. Right? But it's all the product of an unjust acquisition of terrorism. So you have to keep that in mind when you think about when you have to answer the question, why are black people broke? Because we've never been made whole, and we've always been dependent. I can't be the only one, and you can just say this in chat. I can't be the only one whose advocacy for black people has cost them promotions or jobs, or you could have done better had you just kept your mouth shut and let whoever's in power screw your black neighbor, right? So, and sometimes not even metaphorically. So we had a system. We currently have a system where it actually costs you to be for making black descendants of slaves whole, and benefits you for treating them like a subordinate class. This is why DeSantis over in Florida dredged up the specter of African American studies just to kick it, saying that we hate AP African American studies. Nobody mentioned it, but Rick DeSantis is like, and by the way, screw the Negroes. And that's because it pays to be anti-black in a way. It pays. And, depending on who you talk to, it pays the GOP more than it pays the Dems, but it also pays the Dems. Make no mistake. Raphael Warnock, there's a video of him dodging a question about reparations, which is unfortunate. And we need to understand that that's because he knows, and, Stacey Abrams had to, sanitize her talk because, she knows that it pays to treat black people like garbage, or not talk about the specific struggle that follows the lineage of blackness and lineage in general, but especially in the American South, but just in general, like descendants of slaves. So you have to study Jim Crow. You have to study Jim Crow before you study the civil rights movement, or in addition to the civil rights movement. And don't let these civil rights leaders tell you the story, because they'll only tell you the victories that they won. They won't actually tell you the things where, well, their grandkids aren't doing so well. So like you can kind of put it together, right? And you need to study Jim Crow before you can answer the question, why are black people broke? Because, we were targeted. And then they set up the structures of dependency so that it's impossible to be autonomous. And once again, to be autonomous means to be able to negate or the will of outsiders who would actually impose your will. Hey, which child of mine is this? Oh, Grant, come on, come say hi to the people.
Hi, people.
Hi, people. All right,
I'm on book 7.
She's on book 7 of Wings of Fire. All right, so thank you for your time. What's up?
Winter turning.
All right, thank you for your time. I will see you next week, and bye.